St Mary's, Linton, my parish church, just to do, it always used to be an evening called Songs and Sonnets, and I would bring my guitar as well and alternate poems and songs, but bitter experience has taught me that trying to sing through Zoom doesn't work. So it's going to be really poems and stories, and I've rather daringly called it Malcolm's Adventures with his Muse. And I am going to talk a little bit about the sense of the muse, the sense of poetry that comes as a gift, as a kind of sudden lift of love, as a kind of inspiration. And roughly speaking, I'm going to do things chronologically, and I'm going to read from the 5 volumes of poetry that I've published, and plus the 6th little pamphlet that I published for the Care Workers charity as well in this current COVID crisis. But that's the plan, but we'll dart back and forth. But I actually want to, I'm going to start with a poem that I often start a reading with, which is a poem that I began to write about poetry and what poetry is and the music in poetry. But as I wrote it, I discovered that it was also a poem about prayer. And for me, poetry and prayer are very closely and deeply intertwined. And it happens to begin this poem, which is called The Singing Bowl. It happens to begin with the word begin. So it seems, you know, as Julie Andrews said, you know, a very good place to start. So I'll read this, and just as a way of kind of, I don't know out of what stresses or chaos you have somehow contrived to step for an hour of peace and poetry, but maybe we could always do in the current circumstances with a little bit of stilling. And this is a kind of stilling and opening and listening and resonating kind of poem. And it's called The Singing Bowl. It's from this book, The Singing Bowl. And the photo on the cover of the book is in fact a singing bowl that we possess, which you don't even have to strike it. You just run the beaters sort of tremulously and tremblingly around its rim. And it's a bit like kind of running your finger around a wine glass. It just trembles into sound and has very beautiful tones and overtones. Anyway, here we are, Singing Bowl. Begin the song exactly where you are. Remain within the world of which you're made. Call nothing common in the earth or air. Accept it all and let it be for good. Start with the very breath you breathe in now. This moment's pulse, this rhythm in your blood, and listen to it, ringing soft and low. Stay with the music, words will come in time. Slow down your breathing. Keep it deep and slow. Become an open singing bowl, whose chime is richness rising out of emptiness, and timelessness resounding into time. And when the heart is full of quietness, begin the song exactly where you are. So I wrote that poem many years ago, but it's one of those poems that sort of has come back and resonated in a new way for me in the course of lockdown. Those words, begin the song exactly where you are. I might rightly say, well, I haven't got any bloody choice, have I? That's exactly where I'll begin the song. That's where I am. But actually, that sense that even where I am now, this moment, this breath, this pulse, this air I'm breathing, this place I'm rooted in, is always a good place to begin. And in a curious way, once we were allowed for our hours exercise and then for a bit more, you know, Linton has been an absolutely wonderful place in which to be locked down, I have to say. I've come to love the village, and I'm feeling that love even more strongly now that Maggie and I know we're moving on, and Maggie will be moving on from being the rector here in the summer. And it's given an extra poignancy to my many walks around Linton, and I'm going to read some poems that have particular links in different ways with places in Linton. But although I'm going to revert shortly to a sort of chronological thing and talk about how the whole poetry business began with me, I I want to make the first poem after that opening singing bowl, a poem which in fact I had the pleasure of reading when I had the immense joy of at last celebrating an Easter communion in the church. It was so strange and odd not to be in church last Easter. But happily, Maggie assigned me. I mean, in my other roles, I'm one of Maggie's, various adjunct clergy, and I get my rota the same as everybody else. But Maggie kindly assigned me to do the 8 o'clock prayer book communion on Easter Sunday. And that, I can't tell you what a joy it was to celebrate and share communion really in the place with real people. And on that occasion, I chose to read a poem which I had published in a book called After Prayer, which is called O Bard. Now, the O Bard is a poetic form. It's a kind of genre, and it's poetry set at dawn as sunrise. And in the genre or form, it's a dialogue between lovers. Speaking of a dialogue between lovers, I see Maggie has just joined us now, which is great because she's going to share reading this poem. And there are various famous obards. I mean, there's a great folk song, Lay Still My Fond Shepherd, or Don't You Rise Yet. It's the bright sun is shining beside my love, it is wet. Let it be wet, my love, and ever so cold. I must rise, me fond Floro, and away to my fold. Oh, the lark in the morning, she rises from her nest, and she climbs through the air with the dew on her breast. And there's lots of poems of that sort. Romeo and Juliet share one. There's John Donne's famous Busy Old Fool, Unruly Sun, why dost thou thus through curtains and through call on us, but through windows call on us. But one time I decided to imagine a kind of obard between Christ as the lover of us, as the lover of our souls and ourselves, and the sleep from which the lover wishes to awake us, not being simply sleep itself, but being the sleep of death. That some sense that he rests with us, he lies with us as he lay in the sepulchre. He comes, mine was the tomb in which he lay. But he does so that he can rise, and in his rising call us to rise too. As in Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive. So I made this obard, which I imagined as a sort of dialogue, a ballad style dialogue between Christ and the soul. And I'm going to share the reading of it now with Maggie, and we're going to reverse roles a bit later on. There's another sequence of poetry she's going to help me with where she will read the part of Christ. But on this occasion, I'm going to read Christ's words, and she's going to read the soul's reply. So this is O Bard from After Prayer. And I read this poem on Easter morning to the congregation at the 8 o'clock in lieu of a sermon. And are you sleeping still, my love? The sun is on the rise. A gentle west wind lifts the leaves and songbirds fill the skies.
I closed my eyes in sorrow, love, my heart as cold as stone, and thought, as darkness covered me, that I would lie alone. I closed my eyes in weariness, I closed my eyes in pain, and never thought I should be called to open them again.
But you were not alone, my love. Your weariness was mine. I brought a light into the dark that you might see it shine. I too endured the deadly cold that chilled us to the bone, that I might warm the sepulchre and roll away the stone. Awaken now to life, my love. Arise, alive and free. Shake off the sleep of death, my love, and come away with me.
And she has risen from her bed and held her arms out wide and touched his wounded hands and heart and gone to be his bride.
Thank you, Maggie. So I read that this Easter day. And there's another Easter poem, just while we're in the season, that I'd like to share with you, which again I wrote while I was in Linton, and in fact composed the most part of while I was out walking. I've got lots of sort of lovely walks I like to do around Linton. And I was walking, it was very muddy. I was coming out of the little bit patch of wood that there is when you go over to Little Linton and cross the bridge, and you can, when you're walking your way back towards Kingfisher Walk, it's a kind of woody bit that you can go through. And quite a lot of it came to me there. And it's called a villanelle for Easter Day. And again, it's in light of this whole COVID crisis. And it has the sense that the rolling away of the stone, the stone, the heavy stone, who will move the stone for us? It's as though we've all had a great heavy stone rolled against the kind of entrances and egresses of our lives. And perhaps we get a sense now with the vaccine and with the various things that the stone is gradually being rolled away. So this is a villanelle for Easter Day. As though some heavy stone were rolled away, you find an open door where all was closed, wide as an empty tomb on Easter Day. Lost in your own dark wood, alone, astray, you pause, as though some secret were disclosed. The sky above you, wan and grey, wide through those shadowed branches interposed, wide as an empty tomb on Easter Day. Perhaps there's light enough to find your way, for now the tangled woods feel less enclosed, as though some heavy stone were rolled away. You lift your feet out of the miry clay and seek the light in which you once reposed, wide as an empty tomb on Easter Day. And then love calls your name. You hear him say, the way is open. Death has been deposed, as though some heavy stone were rolled away. And you are free at last on Easter Day. So that was just to open us out with some Easter poems. And that last poem, a poem that was composed walking around the lovely walks around Linton. But Malcolm's adventures with his muse, well, they go back a long way. And I'm happy to say that that there are 9 muses. They are the daughters of memory. And there's always variety, there's always infinite change and possibility, and different muses meet you, different ways of seeing things, different calls and kindlings in your life as a writer at different stages. But I suppose, properly speaking, my earliest muse is the muse of poetry that was alive and kindled in my mother. My grandmother was a poet. My grandmother was a published poet and had instilled my mother with a love of poetry. And my mother had an extraordinarily retentive memory and recited poetry often and on many occasions. But not, I have to say, although I imbibed a huge amount of poetry, almost with my mother's milk, it wasn't that she sat me in a stiff chair and said, now this is poetry, it's good for you, and sort of dropped it on me from a great height. On the contrary, it would be in the midst of ordinary things. She would suddenly speak a poem and it would lift things. We often traveled when I was a little boy back and forth between Africa and England by sea. And I remember one time coming off the coast when we were coming out of Nigeria, and I was a very little boy, a schooner sailing. There was the little trading ships along the coast there were often still by sail because people couldn't afford engines. And I saw this white-sailed vessel, sailing, and I said, what a lovely boat, Mum. I wonder where it's going. And my mother put her arm around me and gestured towards the boat and said, whither, O splendid ship, thy white sails crowding, leaning across the bosom of the urgent west that fearest nor sea rising nor sky clouding? Whither away, fair rover, and what thy quest? Now, I was just amazed, I didn't know, but it just lifted things up. And she would recite poems. The sun would be setting at sea, an evening, a calm evening at sea, a beautiful sunset. And she'd say, out beyond the sunset. This is actually one of the earliest full poems that I can remember. She recited this so often, it went deep into me. It's one of the primal poems for me. She would go, it's a poem by John Masefield called The Golden City of St. Mary. I'll just give you a bit of it. Out beyond the sunset, could I but find the way, is a sleepy blue laguna that widens to a bay. And there's the blessed city, or so the sailors say, the golden city of St. Mary. Oh, I'll be shipping sunsetwards and westward ho, through the green toppling combers a shattering into snow, till I come to quiet moorings and a watch below in the golden city of St. Mary. Well, that just went right to my heart. I just loved it. And there's a middle verse I couldn't remember all of about, the trestle tables where the gallants dine, singing slow Spanish songs like old mulled wine in the golden city of St. Mary. So my mother, who'd been brought up, I mean, her heritage is, Scots, but Scots, Presbyterian. And so the idea that the son of this Presbyterian, his first sense of the hallows and the holy would be the golden city of St. Mary. It's pretty amazing, but there you go. So I didn't know that was poetry. My mum didn't say this is a poem, but I felt this lift and this beauty and this rhythm. And from even earlier still, she taught me nursery rhymes and played rhythmic patching games with me. So I was very amazed to discover that this stuff was actually written down and that you could find it. And I was given Robert Louis Stevenson's Child Garden of Verses and discovered all the different rhythms you could have, like in his poem From a Railway Carriage, where it goes faster than fairies, faster than witches, bridges and houses and hedges and ditches and so on. So I think that was a deep foundation for me. The love of poetry and the sense that I might write it myself came really in my mid to late teens and was partly connected with being taken by an aunt of mine to visit Keats's house in Hampstead. And I was rather reluctant to go and didn't think it would be interesting. But when I got there, of course, I found that he was this ardent young man who'd been desperately in love with the girl next door and couldn't really take it forward because he was ill. And, and then it so happened that in the room was there with the windows opening into the lawn where the tree was, where the nightingale had sang and where he'd written the poem. And a draft of the poem, a reproduction of his first draft of the poem was up on the wall. And I was a moody 16-year-old, feeling very glum and sort of sorry for myself because I was living in a boarding house that I didn't like. And I looked up at this poem and it said, my heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though if hemlock I had drunk or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past and lethywards had sunk. And I just thought, God, I know how you feel. It's like aches, sunk, lethy, drunk, I thought, God, I'm with you. And of course, it's this really unpromising start to a poem, and then suddenly it changes, doesn't it? Because 'tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou light-winged dryad of the trees in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in a full-throated ease. I thought, oh my goodness, I didn't even know English could sound like that. And then, of course, he takes you out, and it's very sensual. He's walking out into the dark, warm, mothy evening. I cannot tell what flowers are at my feet or what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet. And then you have the most remarkable thing in that poem, which is somewhere just towards the back of the poem. It's like there's these magic casements, as he calls them, the windows that open. And he talks about it. There's no logical reason that leads you to this image. He just gives you the image of magic casements opening on perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. I was utterly enchanted. And for the next, few months, I was a bit like some kid that had been to an Eric Clapton concert and is sitting there playing air guitar because he wants to sound like the maestro. I was sort of playing air Keats, I was trying to sound like that. And I wrote lots of gushy, slushy, anachronistic poems full of quoths and prithys and doths and things. It wasn't very good, but I was trying to get that. And an English teacher kindly explained to me the meter that Keats was using and how to do iambic pentameter, that ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. I cannot tell what flowers are at my feet. And that's a heartbeat of English poetry. And whatever else I've done ever since, I've always tried to keep that music. I mean, I realize that poetry's changed and it's different after Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot and all of that. But I think a certain line of music in English poetry has been lost, and I've been trying to recover it. The problem with my early efforts was that they were, I was like a kind of romantic wannabe. I just didn't care that anything had happened after 1821 when Keats died, So I wasn't connecting with the world around me, and it was therefore not good poetry. And I wasn't using language as is used now. So the great effort for me has been to try and find a way of speaking without anachronism and inversion and over poetic language, but nevertheless to try and recapture that note, that melody. Heard melodies are sweet, says Keats, but those unheard are sweeter. And that's why in my poem about poetry that I've already read you, The Singing Bowl, I had that line, stay with the music, words will come in time. And that's why, insofar as I have a reputation at all, I have a reputation for using form, that the sonnet is the thing that I've chosen as far as I can to master, and that I use rhyme schemes and I care about alliteration and meter and those things, because somebody's got to do it and not very many people are doing it at the moment. So I feel like at least I can kind of keep that thing going. So Keats made me want to be a poet, and then I read widely and voraciously, and of course discovered Shelley, and then looked behind them to Wordsworth and Coleridge. I had the usual dangerous flirtation with Byron, who's mad, bad, and dangerous to know, even in print as well as in person. But you could still learn a huge amount from him. I mean, Byron is capable of absolutely perfect expression, which seems to come with no effort. I mean, you don't know what effort it cost him, but it's if you think about something like, she walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meets in her aspect and her eyes. I mean, that's absolutely perfect poetry. So then I also discovered the joys of Ireland. I found the poetry of Seamus Heaney, who is the one contemporary poet, or perhaps a little bit with Larkin and Hughes, but mainly Heaney, that I felt still had that music, vanished music, as he calls it, twilit water. And eventually I decided to go for a long, between school and university, to go for a long, slow ramble around Ireland. And that was a great adventure. It started in a very adventurous way because I decided to sleep overnight just in my sleeping bag without even a tent in Phoenix Park, and I was robbed. And I kind of ended up wandering along Grafton Street penniless and going into Bewley's coffee house in Grafton Street, where somebody kindly bought me a coffee. And eventually I was able to phone home and get money wired to the post office and sort myself out. But I was still hugely excited by the prospect of what lay before me. And years later, I wrote a poem looking back on that moment, my 19-year-old self, going on this romantic, poetic ramble around Ireland. And I wrote a poem about it. And because I put it on the web, Bewley's coffee shop got hold of it and asked if they could put it up on the wall, which they did. And then they kindly sent me a huge package of coffee, which is great, because on the morning that I was with them, I had not a penny in my pocket and somebody else bought me the coffee. And then just recently, just a few days ago, the granddaughter of the Bewley who founded Bewley's, who was a wonderful, saintly Quaker man, got in touch with me and asked if she could include the poem in the memoirs of her grandfather. And I was there at the launch virtually, which was very good. I have to say the virtual coffee is nothing like as good as the actual coffee you get there. So I thought I'd read you this poem I wrote in Bewley's about the beginning of my sort of adventures as a rambling, wandering poet. In Bewley's. I look up, hands around my coffee cup, on Grafton Street in Bewley's coffee shop. Blue Mountain, Java and Colombian. The labels are a journey on their own. Then the aroma as they're ground by hand, broken and opened. Out of every land, separate savors float across this room of dark mahogany to a softer bloom of stained glass windows, where I sit apart, warming my hands and waiting on my heart to call me to adventure. I have found my voice. Yeats in my pocket. Backpack full of Joyce. I'm 19. It is 1977. And Dublin is the very gate of heaven. So I set off on my various adventures. And in all of those, I felt in some sense that when the poetry came, it came as a kind of gift, that there was something or someone else involved, that although I had to attend to the craft and I had to attend to the openness and to the being there, nevertheless, it seemed to me that the language of the muse was significant. And eventually I wrote a sonnet called Muse, which I'll read to you now. This again, like the last poem, is from the Singing Bowl. Although the Singing Bowl was the second volume of poetry I published in 2013, it contains poems that go right back to earlier times. So here's an evocation of a little of what I feel, insofar as you can. Well, I don't want to say personify inspiration, because I think that diminishes the reality, to use the word personify, of something actually there. So here's my poem called Muse. I stop and sense a subtle presence here, an opalescent shimmer in the light, and catch, just at the corner of my eye, a shifting shape that no one else can see, just on the edge, the very edge of sight, just where the air is brightening and where the sky is colored underneath a cloud. And so she comes to keep her tryst with me. She comes with music, music faintly heard, a trace, a grace note floating in clear air, as over hidden springs the hazels stir. Time quivers. Then she is at my side, a quickened breath, a feather touch on skin, a sudden, swift connection deep within. So that's a little sort of evocation of what I might mean by muse, though perhaps in some ways the muse herself is really the language itself, the extraordinary richness and flexibility and suggestiveness and sheer promise of the English language. I'm going to I'll read you something now from, I mentioned, the moment of writing, and I'm going to change the tone completely now, so I have a little bit of bathos after the romantic evocation of the muse. I have a little shed. Well, I mean, it's a hut. I actually call it the Temple of Peace, because that's what Gladstone used to call his study, and I think it's a nice name, although it's called the Temple of Peace more in hope than expectation. But anyway, it's a hut at the bottom of my garden. I occasionally refer to it grandly as my trysting place with the muse, and it's where I do a lot of my writing when weather permits, because it's unheated. Anyway, in fact, although I have all these grand names for it, it's always referred to in our household as the shed. and I'm simply going to the shed. And one day I said, without thinking, I probably said to Maggie, I must go down to the shed again, thinking I hadn't written for a while. And of course, I realized I was accidentally riffing on a poem that both my mother and my father often quoted to me, which was, I must go down to the sea again, the lonely sea and the sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to see her by, and the wheels kick and the wind's song and the white sails shaking and a grey mist on the sea's face and a grey dawn breaking. So that was the Sea Fever by John Masefield. So literally in the time that it took me, just for fun, I never thought I'd publish this, but then I had the chutzpah to do it. Literally in the time that it took me from the walk from the house to the shed to start writing some more serious poetry, I made up a little poem called not Sea Fever, but Shed Fever. And that's another, I mean, sheds are a thing, men have to have sheds. I was very pleased to see at one point, somebody wrote a book about men and sheds, which was called 50 Shades of Grey, which is great. Anyway, here's my poem called Shed Fever. I must go down to the shed again, the lonely shed and the den. And all I ask is a kindly muse and a hand to guide my pen. And the verse kick and the vowel song and the words warm and willing and a quiet time and a full rhyme and the white page filling. So I've been lucky in many respects that I have had a kindly muse. And my muse comes and helps me to write poetry about every aspect of life. And obviously I'm a priest in the Church of England. I'm a person who is really convinced utterly that the great thing happened that changes everything, that Jesus rose from the dead, and that's where the church starts, and it's all there in the resurrection. And so quite a lot of my poetry has been an attempt to articulate, not on my own behalf alone, of course on my behalf, but also on everybody's behalf, as a kind of bard to the tribe of the Christians, a little of this extraordinary adventure that we find ourselves set upon, and to write poems about what it is to be a Christian. And in fact, the first full proper volume of poetry that I had published by a pucker publisher, as opposed to like doing a little kind of booklet or whatever, was Sounding the Seasons, which came out nearly 10 years ago. It'll be 10 years next year. And I thought maybe for fun, I'd just read you the first and last poems from that, which are both about, in some sense, being church together. And they're about the seasons, and they're about how the whole liturgical year works for us. So I'm going to read you the prologue and the epilogue. You'll have to guess the other 68 poems that lie in between those that take us around the year. Though, of course, my poor captive audience or congregation at the 8 o'clock on in St. Mary's Linton will have heard one or two of these one way or another at the time of their appropriate season. So here's my prologue to Sounding the Seasons, which sets out a bit what I thought I was up to in that Christian sonnet endeavor. Tangled in time, we go by hints and guesses, turning the wheel of each returning year. But in the midst of failures and successes, we sometimes glimpse the love that casts out fear. Sometimes the heart remembers its own reasons and beats a sanctus as we sing our story, tracing the threads of grace, sounding the seasons that lead at last through time to timeless glory. From the first yearning for a Saviour's birth to the full joy of knowing sins forgiven, we start our journey here on God's good earth to catch an echo of the choirs of heaven. I send these out, returning what was lent, turning to praise each moment's monument. And then the final poem, which is also a sanctus, and is thinking particularly about the great sanctus that we sing in the Eucharist, the Sanctus, 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 Holy, Holy, Holy. And it's about It's about our inwovenness together in the mystery of the Eucharist, among other things. So I'll read this particularly as a sort of, dedication to my fellow members and communicants at St. Mary's Linton, for whose benefit we're having this evening. It's about a particular experience I had, in fact, in listening to a Requiem Mass. We gather as his church on God's good earth and listen to the Requiem's intense, long, love-laden keening, calling forth echoes of Eden, blessing every sense with brimming blisses, every death with birth, until all passion passes into praise. I bless the hidden threads that drew us here. I bless this day distinct amidst our days. I bless the light, the music-laden air. I bless the interweaving of our ways, the lifting of the burdens that we bear. I bless the broken body that we share. Sanctus, the heart. Sanctus, the spirit cries. Sanctus, the flesh in every touch replies. So still thinking about St. Mary's Linton and my own role, which is largely, I'm happy to say, to celebrate the Eucharist at the 8 o'clock service. Something I've been thinking about doing for some time, and I now realize time is not going to allow me to do, so I'm going to indulge me. I'm going to do it here. One of the things I do every Sunday morning when I celebrate that Eucharist is to read the 2 great commandments of Jesus to the congregation there, that thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and all thy soul and all thy mind and all thy strength. And the second is like, namely this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And as it happens, when I wrote a book called Parable and Paradox, which is a set of sonnets on the sayings of Jesus, I thought, oh, I'm going to write about those sayings of Jesus, Jesus saying those 2 commandments. And I thought, no problem, it'll be 2 sonnets. But then I realized that, in fact, this what he's saying about all thy heart, all thy soul, all thy strength, all thy mind, each of those requires particular attention. So I ended up writing not 2, but 5 sonnets. And the 5 sonnets took the form of a dialogue between myself and my Saviour. So I'd like to call Maggie back to the fray, as it were. And since I read the part of Christ in the Obard, and she read the part of the soul, we're going to swap roles now. And I'm going to read the part of the soul, and she's going to read the part of Christ in my sequence. And I would love, dear 8 o'clockers, to have done a sequence of 5 8 o'clocks with you on this, but I'm going to do it now instead. And it's really me wondering about the reach of this commandment, the way he goes in to name the different parts of us, the heart and the soul and the strength and the mind, and to think about what that means. And in each case, in the sonnets often have what's called a turn or a volta. You have one part, and then usually around about the 9th line, it turns around and you get a different take. And I use that very specifically in this form, where I just spill the beans to Jesus and say, I really, you cannot be serious. So, well, like, how am I even supposed to begin to do that? And in each case, Jesus replies around about the 9th line, except for the final one, where Jesus cuts me off short after 4 lines and finally lays down what I should be knowing to me. So that seems a very appropriate role for Maggie. So she's going to read the Jesus parts on this. And this is 5 dialogues on the 2 great commandments. And I'll read the commandments again, and then we'll read the poems. Luke 10:27. And he answering said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy strength and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. 1. with all your heart. With all my heart. You know my heart too well. It's Yeats's rag and bone shop. Will it do to start my loving in that little hell, closed on itself and still excluding you? Could I not offer you some empty room, some small apartment full of light and air, some portion of my life above the gloom, but not this pit of pride, not this despair?
Only your heart will do. Let me begin to break the ground and plant a seed that grows up through the closing darkness of your sin, till your unsightly roots bring forth my rose. For I have learned to make the broken true, since my heart was broken once for you.
2, with all your soul. With all my soul? I scarcely know my soul. The age I live in doesn't think it's there. They cut me up where you would make me whole, and think your promise only empty air. They say I'm hormones, chemical extremes, enzymes unwinding blindly, selfish genes, just empty gestures and repeated memes. With all my soul? I don't know what that means.
Before the first life stirred, my spirit called you. I knew you when I wove you in the dark. I made you all more than all the forms that mold you, and kindled in your depth my hidden spark. So let them say your soul is empty air. Love with your soul, and you will know it's there.
With all your strength. With all my strength. What little strength I have is shadowed by the instruments of death. I crawl from dawn to dusk towards my grave, as frail and fleeting as my every breath. And all the strength of broken humankind seems only spent on pain and cruelty, to magnify the malice of the mind and crush the poor in deeper poverty.
And that is why you need to love with strength, and offer all that little strength to me, that you might let me mend it, till at length we bear the weight together, set you free, as one who knows how all is born above, and meets all malice in the strength of love.
With all your mind. With all my mind. With all my open questions, my restless questing after hidden truth. With all my science, all my suppositions, my search for certainty, my lust for proof. With all my mind, its logic and obsession, its wordless reveries, its language games, its reason and its deep imagination, its mysteries, its riddles and its dreams.
With all your mind, with every gift I gave you, for every drop of truth is drawn from me. Not that your mind itself will ever save you, but that it lives within my mystery. Ask and be answered. Seek and you will find. I am the life of every loving mind.
Your neighbor is yourself. My neighbor is myself. I cannot learn to love myself at all. I look away. The dark glass only shames me, and I burn at what should never see the light of day.
I'll be the judge of that, for in my light, judgment and healing meet you equally. The self you loathe is precious in my sight, and I will have you love it into me. You and your neighbour both must be made whole. Her heart's as dark and needy as your own, so you must love her in her hidden soul, the very soul she's trying to disown. Love her as you are loved, and you will find love is your heart, your soul, your strength, your mind.
Well, thank you, Maggie, for playing the part of Christ there, which is just what the marriage service said you should do. So that's all present and correct. so that was a little sampling of some of my poems that are more directly about the nature of my faith, and I suppose that's something that I'm known for. But of course, I write poetry about everything, about all kinds of things, and I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a sampling now of some poems that are a bit more sort of wide-ranging. I may have shocked some of the gentle readers of the Church Times recently. In fact, in this very day's issue, since I write a column for them each week called Poets Corner, by confessing that I am in fact a fan of the Grateful Dead. Well, fan of the Grateful Dead is a rather roundabout way of putting it, because of course we are simply known as Deadheads, is actually the collective term. Anyway, I am. And I find a huge amount in their music, and their music drew me, of course, to the whole kind of topos and mythos of San Francisco and San Francisco at that time. Anyway, it so happened that I've also done a bit of thinking and writing about the poetry of the beats, and there's an interesting figure, Neil Cassidy, who was on the one hand a great friend of Jack Kerouac and others, and is the figure Dean Moriarty in Kerouac's On the Road, but who later then became, curiously, the tour bus driver for the Grateful Dead, and is a kind of link between the two of them. That was the famous bus where they took an old bus and painted it psychedelic, and on the thing where the destination of the bus was, they just wrote the word further. Anyway, it happened in one of my various roles in Cambridge that I was inviting one of the biographers of Kerouac had written a brilliant book for Penguin called Memory Babe, which was a biography of Kerouac. Anyway, he's a poet in his own right and was one of the last of the beat poets, a guy called Jerry Nicosia. And he came over to Cambridge, partly at my instigation, and gave a lecture on Kerouac. And I invited him to give a poetry reading. Because I knew he was part of that whole beat thing, I thought he might like a jazz band to go with his poetry, and I knew a jazz quartet. So we set up a whole jazz poetry evening. And he was very pleased with it. And then perhaps rather foolishly said, well, man, you know, if you're ever in San Francisco, like, come out and we'll do some gigs together and we can do some poetry readings. And thinking, you know, this tweed-clad English prof is never going to... But anyway, for other reasons to do with other talks I was giving, I realized I was going to be in Los Angeles. And I thought, oh, yeah, I could go to San Francisco. So I emailed him and said, you know, if you did want to do this, I could, but, you know, no worries, no, it doesn't matter. And he was delighted. He said, we'll set up a whole thing. I said, oh, I'd love to visit San Francisco because I'm a Deadhead and I want to see all the Grateful Dead sites. So he said, oh, no problems. You know, we can take you to Haight-Ashbury and everything. So it was all set up. And I paused to think, and I wonder what, you know, my delicately wrought, you know, neo-metaphysical English sonnets are going to go down with this beat stuff. But hey, you know, let's just do it. So he was very vague, you know, being a poet. And he kind of, he just said, call me from the airport. So I arrived at the airport in San Francisco and called this guy up and I said, what do I do now? And he said, oh, just step outside, man, and take the rainbow bus. And I was going like, I realized this is a poet I'm talking to, so maybe this is a metaphor, but it wasn't a metaphor. It was literal. Like there was a bus outside there painted with a rainbow. It took me off to Marin County. And anyway, we met up and we went to the City Lights bookshop and we did this little series of 3 gigs and it all worked really well. Anyway, I wrote a ballad about it. Which I thought I might share with you, which is a kind of quite a piece of fun, but it's all, everything in this ballad is true. It turned out, in fact, that one of the things he wanted to talk to me about, one of the reasons why he was keen to have me there, was that he'd written deeply about the spirituality, the kind of submerged spirituality of the beat writers, and he felt there was a deep Catholic spirituality in Kerouac. His mother was a Catholic, a Christian spirituality, and he was clearly wanting to explore that himself, and indeed that we had important conversations about that. But anyway, here's Cloud Hidden, San Francisco, for Jerry Nicosia. I flew to San Francisco and took the rainbow bus, further into otherness, further into us, further into ecstasy, and further into pain, further than those acid tests and all this acid rain. I climbed the stairs in city lights and tried the poet's chair. My verses formed a golden gate that shimmered in midair. My verses hung a bridge between those Dharma days and mine, suspended between heaven and earth, tense in every line. Snyder breathes the mountain air where mountains walk alone. Ferlinghetti's breathing still, though Ginsberg is long gone. His chants are still vibrating beyond his final bow. He howls a hipster's sanctus with hidden angels now. And Cassidy is everywhere. Garcia's in my head. I'm grateful just to be alive to hear the Grateful Dead. I read with Nicosia, read the faces on the streets. I beat these pavements with the man who chronicled the beats. We touch St. Peter and St. Paul where Jack and Neil both prayed, and Dante's writing on the wall says all that can be said. Tonight we read in Berkeley. Tomorrow in North Beach we'll harmonize with mermaids still singing each to each. The skyline writes an epitaph with every vapor trail as Jerry reads his elegies for every vet in jail. And after, in Vesuvio's, we'll drink a few for Jack, whilst Tom says to fare forward and Van sings, take me back. I try to read the glimmer, the strange pearlescent light that graces San Francisco skies and presages the night, and find myself cloud hidden where rhythms never stop, cloud hidden with the poets on the foggy mountain top. Now, I'm conscious that we've been on Zoom for quite a while, and Zoom is a very weird thing. It's quite difficult. I'm glad to see you. I have to flick between a couple of screens to be able to see you. For some of you, I only see names and photos, but for others, I see images. Now, it so happened that at the beginning of the lockdown, when we were all getting used to Zoom, I wrote a sequence of poems called Quarantine Quatrains, which was eventually published in this little leaflet. And it was a kind of response to Fitzgerald's The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, Fitzgerald's beautiful Victorian translation of the Persian poem, The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which you may remember begins with those lovely lines, awake for morning in the bowl of night has flung the stone that puts the stars to flight, and lo, the hunter in the east has caught the sultan's turret in the noose of light. Although the most famous lines in it probably is here with a loaf of bread beneath the bough, a book of verse, a flask of wine, and thou beside me singing in the wilderness. And wilderness is paradise. So now, I've got you, babe. I've got poetry and wine. Like, what's not to like? To loosely paraphrase. So I started off in a way almost lightheartedly riffing on this ancient Persian poem. But as I wrote, and as the lockdown deepened and the death toll rose, it kind of the poetry, and of course there's an elegiac tone there's very much a sense of tempus fugit and an elegy for the lost in the original Rubaiyat as well. So it sort of changed gradually as I wrote it. And in the end, I ended up concluding it with an elegy for those whom we'd lost to COVID, which has now become a little bit of a wider thing on its own and was used in Norwich Cathedral, for example, as a sort of elegy when 1,000 people had died in Norfolk. So I'm going to just read you, and then so in the end I decided I would publish it, but I published it as a fundraiser for the care workers charity, because the final part of the poem is an elegy for the care workers. And in fact, I'm happy to say that we've raised, with this little thing, we've raised over £7,000 for the care workers charity. And I recruited, or, was happy to join with a very fine English artist, Roger Wagner, probably one of the finest sort of, spiritual artists in our day. And he did these series of beautiful miniatures that went with it. Anyway, one of the poems in it, one of the sequences in it, is about being on Zoom. And I was really thrilled that when Roger did it, his Zoom picture, he's turned the Zoom screen, if you see there, into an iconostasis, as it were. So all of us gathered here are really the saints looking through windows at one another to a kind of heaven. But you know how it is, and I can see it twice on this screen even now, that sometimes people are invisible, but they nevertheless leave letters to show who they are. So there are two letters on that screen, and they are Alpha and Omega, which I think is wonderful, the invisible presence of God. So I'm going to read you the little Zoom part of this extended poem, and then I'm going to read you and read with you, and hopefully we can all think and pray for all those the fallen in this terrible pandemic. That'll be the end. But let's just start with a little reflection on Zoom, which seems appropriate for a Zoom poetry reading. Some days I am diverted by a call, the soft computer chime that summons all to show a face to faces that we meet, mirages, empty mirrors on the wall. Alas, that all the friends we ever knew, whose lives were fragrant and whose touch was true, can only meet us on some little screen, then zoom away with scarcely an adieu. We share with them the little that we know, these galleries of ghosts set in a row. They flicker on the screen of life a while, but some have left the meeting long ago. We used to stroll together on the green, who now divide the squares upon the screen. The faces of our friends, so far apart, tease us with tenderness that might have been. Someday we'll break the bread, we'll pour the wine, and meet and kiss and feast beneath the vine. Till then, we'll sweeten solitude with verse and yearn through pain and watch each day decline. But it was when I came to write the final section of this poem, which is called Quarantine Quatrains, and because 40, of course, is in the word quarantine, I thought there should be 40 four-line stanzas. The final ones that lead up to the 40, I really wanted to make as an elegy, and I'll read it now in that mode, and it'll be the penultimate thing I read. I'll have one more thing for you, which has got a very strong St. Mary's link, but I'll read you this first. At close of day, I hear the gentle rain, whilst experts on the radio explain mind-numbing numbers rising by the day, ciphers of unimaginable pain. Each evening, they announce the deadly toll, and patient voices calmly call the roll. I hear the numbers, cannot know the names. Behind each number, mind and heart and soul. Behind each number, one beloved face, a light in life whom no one can replace, leaves on this world a signature, a trace, a gleaning and a memory of grace. All loved and loving, carried to the grave, the ones whom every effort could not save. Amongst them, all those carers whose strong love brought life for others with the lives they gave. The sun sets, and I find myself in prayer, lifting aloft the sorrows that we share. Feeling for words of hope amidst despair, I voice my vespers through the quiet air. O Christ, who suffers with us, hold us close, deep in the secret garden of the rose. Raise over us the banner of your love, and raise us up beyond our last repose. So I see we're sort of coming towards the end of our time, even though we sort of started a bit late, so I've gone on slightly later. So I'm going to finish with a poem which I think will, for me at least, always be indelibly linked with St. Mary's Linton. It's from my most recent volume, David's Crown, which is a series of poetic responses to praying and reading through the Book of Psalms during the course of this pandemic. And Psalm 84, of course, How lovely are thy dwelling places, O Lord. You know, the swallow hath found her home, and the sparrow a nest, even the courts of thy house, O God. You know, it's a great psalm of yearning and longing. My heart hath a longing to be there. It's somebody who can't quite get to the temple, longing to be there. And of course, it became, I think, a heart song for many of us when the churches were closed and locked and we couldn't get to our own parish church. And I wrote that, my own poetic response to Psalm 84, very much in that mode. And so I want to tell you that when the church was opened and unlocked again and open for private prayer and we could go in, one of the very first things I did was to go into St. Mary's in Linton and read this poem aloud just by myself in the church. So I'm going to finish this event, which has really been part of my thank you to St. Mary's for being such a wonderful, you know, and welcoming parish church to me and to Maggie over these times that we've been here. But this is not only about St. Mary's, this is about the love that any of us might have for our own parish church. So, Quam Delecta is how it starts in Latin, and that's the title I've given it. How lovely. Here's my poem. Yahweh saves. Our God is merciful. And how I long to enter in his courts, to nestle at his altar, and to dwell with him forever. Day and night my thoughts are yearning towards the beauty of his temple in swallow flights of song. For in his courts, time is transfigured, opened out and ample. It touches on eternity. I stay a while within this quiet church. Its simple furnishings and storied windows say more to me of heaven than the pale abstractions of theology. A day spent in an empty church has been as full of goodness as an age elsewhere. I feel its peace refresh me like a holy well. So thank you very much for coming to this event. Thank you for supporting St. Mary's by buying a ticket. Thanks for bearing with us on all of this. Thank you to Charlotte for setting it up. I'm going to hand back to Charlotte now. And I don't know, Charlotte, if we have some time.